The first runner dropped at 412 meters. The second fell 15 seconds later at 398 meters. Both shots came from a position that every sniper manual said was impossible to use effectively, from a man braced against wooden rafters in a barn loft with no sandbags, no bipod, no proper support of any kind. Corporal Jakob Reinhardt had just violated every rule in the Wehrmacht sniper doctrine, and in doing so, he'd stopped an enemy counterattack before it could begin. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him. It was October 21st, 1944, and the Eastern Front had collapsed into a grinding retreat that stretched from the Baltic to the Carpathians. Reinhardt was positioned in the loft of a collapsed barn outside Goldap, East Prussia, watching Soviet forces probe the German defensive line that was supposed to protect the approaches to the Reich itself. His orders were simple: observe and report enemy movements, engage targets of opportunity, and under no circumstances use improvised firing positions that couldn't provide stable support for precision shooting. He was about to ignore that last order completely, and in doing so, he would demonstrate something that marksmanship instructors have been arguing about since the invention of the rifle. Sometimes the fundamentals are wrong. Sometimes doctrine written by experts in controlled conditions fails catastrophically when applied to actual combat. And sometimes a 23-year-old farmhand from Saxony who learned to shoot crows from barn rafters knows more about practical marksmanship than every training manual in the Wehrmacht. Reinhardt had been a sniper for 11 months, trained at the Wehrmacht Sniper School in Königsbruck, where instructors drilled him in proper shooting positions, stable firing platforms, the importance of sandbags and bipods, and anything that would eliminate body movement from the shooting equation. The instructors were emphatic. A sniper's accuracy depends on eliminating variables, and the human body is full of variables. Heartbeat, breathing, muscle tremor, all of it introduces movement that degrades precision. The solution is external support. Solid platforms that turn the rifle into an extension of the earth itself rather than an extension of the shooter's unstable flesh and bone. Reinhardt understood the theory. He'd scored well in training, qualified as a marksman, been assigned to a reconnaissance unit as their designated sharpshooter. But he'd also grown up on a farm where his father paid him 10 pfennigs for every crow he killed, where the crows were smart and wary and wouldn't sit still for the 30 seconds it took to set up a proper shooting position. So Reinhardt learned to shoot fast, learned to shoot from awkward positions, learned to brace his rifle against barn rafters and fence posts and tree branches, and anything else that was available when a target presented itself. His instructors would have been horrified. Shooting from rafters violated every principle of marksmanship. The wood was never perfectly horizontal, always at slight angles that threw off your zero. The contact point was narrow, maybe 3 inches wide, not the broad, stable surface that proper shooting required. There was no way to load the bipod forward, no way to create the tension that stabilized the rifle. And worst of all, the shooter had to contort his body into uncomfortable positions, had to twist and crane and balance in ways that introduced exactly the kind of muscle tension that proper shooting positions were designed to eliminate. But Reinhardt had killed maybe 300 crows shooting from rafters, and crows at 50 meters are roughly the same angular size as a man's torso at 400 meters. The skills transferred, the muscle memory transferred, and most importantly, the speed transferred. While other snipers were setting up sandbags and adjusting bipods and settling into textbook positions, Reinhardt could brace against a rafter, acquire his target, and fire in under 8 seconds. Speed had never mattered in training. The instructor set up scenarios where targets appeared and stayed visible for minutes, where there was always time to set up properly, where rushing was penalized and patience was rewarded. But combat wasn't like training. In combat, targets appeared for seconds, moved unpredictably, disappeared behind cover before you could set up a perfect shot. In combat, the sniper who could deliver a good shot quickly beat the sniper who could deliver a perfect shot slowly, because perfect shots on vanished targets don't hit anything. Reinhardt had learned this during his first week at the front, had watched a senior sniper spend 40 seconds setting up on a Soviet officer who was visible through a gap in a wall. The sniper was still adjusting his sandbags when the officer moved, and the opportunity was lost. Reinhardt had thought about his father's crows, Thought about the dozens of times he'd had 3 seconds to shoot before the bird spooked. Thought about all those shots from rafters that looked impossible but worked anyway. The next day, when a similar opportunity appeared, Reinhardt didn't bother with sandbags. He braced his rifle against a wooden window frame, acquired a target through his scope, controlled his breathing, and fired in 6 seconds. The Soviet officer went down at 340 meters, clean hit to the upper chest, dead before he hit the ground. The squad leader looked at Reinhardt like he performed magic, asked how he made that shot so fast. Reinhardt just shrugged and said he'd grown up shooting crows. But word got back to the battalion sniper coordinator, a sergeant who'd been through the same training Reinhardt had, who believed in doctrine and proper technique, and doing things by the manual. The sergeant pulled Reinhardt aside, explained in patient tones that field-expedient shooting positions were acceptable in emergencies but should not become standard practice. Snipers were supposed to set up properly, use proper support, follow proper procedure. Improvisation was a sign of poor planning, and poor planning got snipers killed. Reinhardt listened and nodded and agreed, because you didn't argue with sergeants who had 3 years on the Eastern Front and 2 wound badges, and the quiet certainty of men who'd survived by following rules. Then Reinhardt went back to his squad and kept shooting the way his father had taught him, fast and improvised and effective, because targets didn't wait for proper setup and the war didn't care about doctrine. By October 1944, the situation had deteriorated to the point where doctrine mattered less than results. The Soviet summer offensive had shattered Army Group Center, had pushed German forces back 300 miles, had brought the Red Army to the borders of the Reich itself. Every soldier knew what was coming, knew that Soviet forces would cross into Germany, knew that the war was lost but had to be fought anyway because there was no alternative except surrender and whatever horrors would follow. Reinhardt's unit was assigned to the defense of Goldap, a small town in East Prussia that sat astride one of the main approach routes toward Königsberg. The defensive line was thin, undermanned, equipped with weapons that were worn out from 3 years of constant use. The soldiers were mostly teenagers and old men, the survivors of divisions that had been destroyed and reconstituted 3 or 4 times. They were tired, they were scared, and they knew they were expected to hold against Soviet forces that outnumbered them 5-1. Reinhardt's position was a barn on a slight rise that overlooked nearly a kilometer of open ground to the east. The barn had been hit by artillery during the initial Soviet probing attacks, had lost half its roof and most of its walls. What remained was the basic structure, wooden support posts, roof rafters, and a loft that was mostly intact. It wasn't ideal for a sniper position. It was too exposed, too obvious, too likely to draw artillery fire once the Soviets figure out someone was shooting from it. But it had one advantage that made it worth the risk. The elevation gave Reinhardt clear sight lines across the entire Soviet approach, could see all the way to the tree line 800 meters out, could observe troop movements and identify targets before they got close enough to threaten the German line. In the kind of fighting that was coming, early warning was worth more than concealment. Reinhardt set up in the loft, arranged what remained of some hay bales to create a basic hide, positioned himself where he could see through gaps in the damaged walls. He had his rifle, a Carabiner 98K fitted with a ZF-42 scope, and 240 rounds of ammunition. He had a canteen, some black bread, and a few pieces of sausage that was more gristle than meat. He had a map, binoculars, and a field telephone that connected back to the company command post 300 meters behind the barn. What he didn't have was a proper firing position. The floor of the loft was damaged, boards missing, unsafe to put weight on. The hay bales were too compressed to provide stable support. There was nothing in the barn that met training standards for a sniper platform. What there was, running the length of the loft at chest height when Reinhardt stood, was a series of wooden rafters, each about 4 inches wide, that had supported the barn's roof before artillery tore sections away. Reinhardt looked at those rafters and thought about crows. Thought about being 14 years old, sitting in his father's barn with a single-shot .22 rifle, waiting for crows to land on the fence posts outside. Thought about bracing the rifle against a rafter, feeling the solid wood against the forestock, using his left hand to pull the rifle tight against the wood, while his right hand controlled the trigger. Thought about taking shots that his father said were impossible and hitting anyway, because impossible and difficult aren't the same thing. He tested the position, pressed his rifle against a rafter, looked through the scope. The height was good, gave him a solid view of the approaches. The wood was smooth, worn from years of friction, wouldn't snag on his rifle. The angle was wrong, maybe 2 degrees off horizontal, but he could compensate by adjusting his body position. It wasn't textbook, wasn't what the instructors would recommend, but it felt familiar, felt like home. The Soviet attack began at 0520 hours, in the gray pre-dawn light, when visibility was poor and defenders were at their weakest. Reinhardt heard the artillery first, the distinctive crump of Soviet 76mm guns firing from positions beyond the tree line. The shells came screaming in, impacting across the German defensive line, throwing up geysers of frozen earth and shattered wood. Then came the mortars closer and faster, walking their fire toward the German positions. Through a scope, Reinhardt could see Soviet infantry emerging from the tree line, spread out in a skirmish line that looked like it stretched for half a kilometer. They were moving fast, using the artillery to suppress German defensive fire, trying to close the distance before the defenders could respond effectively. It was good tactics, professional and well executed, the kind of assault that would overwhelm the thin German line unless something disrupted it. Reinhardt got on the field telephone, reported the attack to company headquarters, gave estimates of enemy strength and direction of advance. The company commander acknowledged, said artillery support would take 10 minutes to arrange, told Reinhardt to engage targets at his discretion. 10 minutes. The Soviet infantry would be on top of the German positions in 10 minutes, and artillery support would arrive just in time to shell positions the Soviets had already overrun. Reinhardt hung up the telephone and looked through his scope again. The Soviet line was 450 meters out, moving steadily through the open ground. He could see individual soldiers, see their weapons, see the way they moved in tactical bounds with one group covering while another advanced. Professional soldiers, experienced, not the conscripts and penal battalion troops that sometimes got thrown into attacks. These men knew what they were doing. He needed to disrupt them, needed to break their rhythm, needed to introduce uncertainty into their advance. A few well-placed shots wouldn't stop the attack, but they might slow it down, might make the Soviets more cautious, might buy enough time for German artillery to arrive and break up the assault. But he needed to shoot fast, needed to engage multiple targets before they got close enough that his position became irrelevant. Proper doctrine said to set up a stable position, sandbags or bipod, make every shot count. But setting up properly would take 30 seconds, maybe 40, and by then the Soviets would have advanced another 60 meters. 30 seconds to set up, 10 seconds to acquire target, 3 seconds to shoot. Call it 45 seconds per target. He could maybe get 4 or 5 shots off before the Soviet line reached the German positions. Or he could shoot from the rafters, fast and improvised, accepting slightly reduced accuracy in exchange for speed. 8 seconds per shot instead of 45. He could engage 15 or 20 targets in the same time frame, could create disruption all along the Soviet line, could turn one sniper into what looked like multiple shooters spread across the German position. Reinhardt made a decision in about 2 seconds. Made it based on 300 dead crows and his father's voice in his head, saying that fast and good enough beats slow and perfect when the crows are flying. He positioned himself against a rafter, pressed the rifle's forestock tight against the wood, used his left hand to create tension pulling the rifle against the support, and looked through a scope. The Soviet line was at 420 meters. He picked a target, a soldier who was moving slightly ahead of the others, possibly a squad leader. Ranged him for 112 meters. Light wind from the northwest, maybe 2 meters per second. Temperature near freezing. He'd already zeroed his rifle for 400 meters that morning, so the elevation was close. Wind would push the round maybe 6 inches right. He aimed 6 inches left of center mass, controlled his breathing, felt his heartbeat, timed his trigger pull for the natural pause between beats. The rifle fired. The recoil was wrong, felt different than when shooting from a proper position, felt like the energy was transferring into the rafter instead of into his shoulder. But through the scope, he saw the target go down, saw the soldier crumple in a way that meant solid hit, probably fatal. First shot, first hit, at 412 meters from a position that wasn't supposed to work. Reinhardt worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered a new round. swung the rifle slightly left, found another target, a soldier who'd frozen when the man next to him dropped. 408 meters. Same wind, same conditions. Aimed, breathed, fired. Second target down. Worked the bolt again, found a third target, fired again. 3 shots, 3 hits, all in under 20 seconds. The Soviet line was reacting now. Soldiers dropping into prone positions, trying to locate the shooter, returning fire toward the German positions. But their fire was scattered, suppressive, not aimed. They hadn't located Reinhardt's position yet. Didn't know exactly where the shots were coming from. He had maybe another minute before they figured it out and started directing fire at the barn. He used that minute. Engaged 6 more targets in 40 seconds, shooting methodically along the Soviet line. Prioritizing soldiers who looked like leaders or who were carrying radios or who were trying to organize their squads. 9 shots, 8 hits, 1 miss when a soldier dropped into cover at the exact moment Reinhardt fired. 8 Soviet soldiers down in under a minute, and the attack was already losing momentum, was starting to look disorganized as squad leaders went down and nobody was sure who was supposed to take command. Then the Soviets found him. Machine gun fire raked the barn, bullets punching through the damaged walls, ricocheting off support posts, tearing through what was left of the hay bales. Reinhardt dropped flat against the loft floor, felt rounds passing overhead, heard the distinctive crack of near misses. His position was compromised. Staying in the barn meant dying in the next 30 seconds when the Soviets brought up something heavier than machine guns. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition, crawled toward the back of the loft where a hole in the wall offered an exit, dropped through the hole to the ground level, and ran. Behind him, the barn exploded as Soviet mortars found the range. 82 millimeters rounds turned the structure into kindling and splinters. Reinhardt made it 50 meters before he dove into a shell crater, breathing hard, covered in dust and bits of hay, but alive. The Soviet attack stalled at 300 meters from the German line. The survivors pinned down by machine gun fire, without leadership, without the momentum that had driven them forward. German artillery arrived 7 minutes later, 8 minutes after Reinhardt's initial report, right on schedule but no longer necessary. The Soviet forces pulled back, dragging wounded, leaving bodies scattered across 400 meters of open ground. Reinhardt made it back to German lines through a communication trench, reported to his company commander, explained what had happened. The commander looked at him like he'd grown a second head, asked how many targets he'd engaged. Reinhardt said 9 confirmed hits, maybe 8 kills. The commander asked how long he'd been in position before artillery forced him out. Reinhardt said about 70 seconds. 9 targets in 70 seconds. It was statistically impossible for a bolt-action rifle, was roughly 6 times faster than doctrine said was achievable, was a kind of performance that made officers suspicious that someone was exaggerating or lying. But other soldiers had observed the Soviet attack, had seen multiple enemy soldiers go down in rapid succession, had seen the assault lose cohesion before artillery support arrived. The numbers checked out. Reinhardt had done exactly what he claimed. The company commander sent a report up the battalion, noted the unusual engagement, recommended Reinhardt for commendation. The report reached the same sergeant who'd warned Reinhardt about improvised shooting positions, who'd emphasized the importance of following proper doctrine. The sergeant read the report, read it again, then walked down to the company position to talk to Reinhardt personally. The conversation was professional and cold. The sergeant acknowledged that Reinhardt had been effective, that his shooting had disrupted the Soviet attack, that his actions had probably saved German lives. Then the sergeant explained, in tones that left no room for argument, that Reinhardt's methods were not acceptable, were not reproducible, were not something that could be taught to other snipers. The Rafters' only position was forbidden, was too risky, was a kind of cowboy nonsense that got snipers killed when it stopped working. Reinhardt was ordered to use proper shooting positions from now on, proper support, proper setup. The sergeant was emphatic. Doctrine exists for a reason, is based on accumulated experience from thousands of snipers, is designed to maximize effectiveness while minimizing risk. One successful engagement using improvised methods didn't invalidate decades of marksmanship knowledge. Reinhardt was to follow standard procedures, and any further violations would result in his removal from sniper duties. Reinhardt listened and agreed, because you didn't argue with sergeants who had doctrinal authority and who could make your life miserable if you pushed back. Then he went back to his squad and thought about what the sergeant had said, thought about doctrine and accumulated experience and the difference between training ranges and actual combat. The sergeant wasn't wrong about doctrine being based on experience. But that experience came from specific contexts, from situations where snipers had time to set up properly, where targets were visible for extended periods, where the fundamentals of marksmanship could be applied without compromise. That wasn't the kind of fighting happening in East Prussia in October 1944. That was fighting where Soviet forces came in waves, where targets appeared and vanished in seconds, where speed mattered more than perfection. But Reinhardt understood the larger issue. He'd been effective, but his methods couldn't be taught easily, couldn't be standardized, depended on skills he learned over years of shooting crows in his father's barn. You couldn't put brace rifle against rafter and shoot fast in a training manual and expect it to work for soldiers who hadn't spent their childhood learning to make those kinds of shots. Doctrine had to be teachable, had to be reproducible, had to work for average soldiers in average circumstances. Reinhardt's methods worked for him, but they weren't scalable. And military organizations need scalable solutions, need tactics that can be taught to thousands of soldiers, not techniques that only work for specialists with unusual backgrounds. The sergeant was protecting doctrine, protecting the training pipeline, protecting the system that turned farm boys and factory workers into competent snipers. The problem was that protecting doctrine sometimes meant preventing innovation, meant discouraging soldiers from finding better ways to do things, meant enforcing standardization at the cost of effectiveness. Reinhardt had found a method that worked, that was faster than standard technique, that had achieved results doctrine said were impossible, and he was being told to stop using it, to revert to slower methods, because his technique wasn't teachable to others. It was frustrating, but Reinhardt understood. The military wasn't designed to optimize individual performance. It was designed to optimize organizational performance, and organizational performance depended on standardization and reproducibility. Better to have 1,000 snipers shooting at 70% effectiveness using teachable methods than to have 10 exceptional snipers shooting at 90% effectiveness using techniques nobody else could master. But understanding the logic didn't mean agreeing with it. Doctrine written for normal circumstances was being applied to desperate circumstances, and desperate circumstances required desperate measures. The Eastern Front in October 1944 wasn't normal. It was a grinding retreat against overwhelming odds, where every day brought new casualties, and every position was untenable, and every soldier knew that survival was mostly luck. In that context, enforcing peacetime training standards seemed absurd. 2 days after the sergeant's visit, Soviet forces attacked again, this time in greater strength with better artillery support. Reinhardt was positioned in a different location, a bunker with proper sandbags and a solid shooting platform, exactly what doctrine recommended. He engaged 6 targets over the course of the 2-hour battle, killed 4, missed 2 because the targets moved before he could fire. Good performance by doctrinal standards, but slower than he knew he could shoot, less effective than his rafter technique. The German line held, barely, with heavy casualties. Reinhardt survived, but 3 men in his squad didn't, killed by Soviet artillery that had time to find their positions because the attack wasn't disrupted early. Reinhardt thought about the barn, thought about the 9 targets he'd hit in 70 seconds, thought about whether faster shooting might have disrupted this attack enough to save some of those 3 lives. There was no way to know. Combat doesn't offer controlled experiments, doesn't let you rerun scenarios with different variables to see what works better. All you have is what happened. And what happened was that 3 men died while Reinhardt followed doctrine and shot from proper positions at proper speeds. He thought about his father's crows again, thought about learning to shoot fast because crows don't wait, thought about all those shots from rafters that everyone said were impossible but worked anyway. His father had never cared about doctrine or proper technique or teachable methods. His father cared about dead crows, paid 10 pfennigs per bird, didn't ask questions about how the shots were made. Results mattered, methods were secondary. But his father wasn't fighting a war, wasn't part of a military organization that needed standardization and reproducibility. His father was one man solving one problem, not an institution trying to train thousands of soldiers to consistent standards. The comparison wasn't fair, but Reinhardt couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop wondering if maybe doctrine was wrong, if maybe the experts who wrote the training manuals had forgotten something important about practical marksmanship. The war ground on. Soviet forces pushed deeper into East Prussia, overrunning defensive positions, forcing German units to fall back toward Königsberg. Reinhardt's company retreated with them, fighting delaying actions, taking casualties, losing ground. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and everyone knew the end was coming, knew that Germany had lost the war, knew that what they were doing now was just buying time for civilians to evacuate. On November 3rd, 1944, Reinhardt found himself in another barn, another improvised position overlooking Soviet approach routes. The situation was almost identical to the one 2 weeks earlier. Damaged structure, wooden rafters, no proper shooting platform, Soviet forces advancing in the distance. This time, Reinhardt didn't hesitate. He positioned himself against the rafters, same technique his father had taught him, same method that doctrine said was forbidden. The Soviet attack came at dawn. Reinhardt engaged 12 targets in 90 seconds, killed 10, disrupted the assault badly enough that German machine gun crews had time to set up proper fields of fire. The attack stalled, the Soviets pulled back, and the German line held for another day. Reinhardt survived, relocated before Soviet counter-battery fire could find him, reported back to his squad. Nobody asked how he'd shot so fast. Nobody questioned his methods. Nobody mentioned doctrine. The sergeant who'd forbidden rafter shooting was dead, killed 3 days earlier by artillery. The company commander who'd reported Reinhardt's unusual techniques was wounded and evacuated. The new officers were focused on survival, on holding the line one more day, on managing a desperate situation with inadequate resources. They didn't care how Reinhardt was shooting, only that he was hitting targets and disrupting Soviet attacks. Over the next 3 weeks, Reinhardt used the rafter technique 7 more times, always in similar situations where speed mattered more than perfect accuracy, where targets appeared briefly and vanished quickly, where conventional methods were too slow to be effective. He killed 43 Soviet soldiers using a technique that was forbidden by doctrine, that couldn't be taught other snipers, that worked only because he'd spent his childhood shooting crows from barn rafters. The war ended for Reinhardt on November 28, 1944, when Soviet artillery hit his position directly, buried him under timber and frozen earth, broke his left leg and 3 ribs. He survived, was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a hospital in Königsberg, then evacuated again when Königsberg itself came under siege. The war continued without him, ground to the final terrible months until Germany surrendered in May 1945. Reinhardt survived the war, spent 2 years in a Soviet labor camp, was released in 1947, made it back to Saxony, which was now part of the Soviet occupation zone. His father's farm was gone, collectivized, the barn where he'd learned to shoot demolished to make room for agricultural machinery. Reinhardt found work in a factory, married, had 2 children, lived quietly through the Cold War years in East Germany. He never talked about the war, never mentioned the rafter technique, never told anyone about the argument with doctrine or the sergeant who'd forbidden his methods. It was all buried in the past, filed away with thousands of other wartime experiences that seemed increasingly distant and unreal as the years passed. The only thing that remained was the occasional dream, the kind where he was 14 again, sitting in his father's barn with a rifle braced against a rafter, watching crows land on fence posts outside, hearing his father's voice promising 10 pfennigs per bird. After the Berlin Wall fell and East Germany ceased to exist, military historians started interviewing veterans, collecting stories, documenting the small tactical innovations that had shaped combat on the Eastern Front. One historian found Reinhardt's name in casualty reports, tracked him down, asked about his sniper service. Reinhardt was 73 by then, still sharp, still remembered the details. He told the historian about the rafter technique, explained how it worked, described the engagement where he'd hit 9 targets in 70 seconds. The historian was skeptical, asked how that was possible with a bolt-action rifle, suggested that maybe Reinhardt's memory was faulty. Reinhardt just smiled and said that his father had taught him to shoot crows, and crows don't wait for perfect setup. The historian did some research, found the unit records, found the after-action reports from those October and November battles. The numbers matched Reinhardt's account. Multiple engagements where Soviet attacks were disrupted by rapid sniper fire, where casualty reports listed numbers that seemed impossible for single snipers using bolt-action rifles. The documentation was there, buried in archives, confirming what Reinhardt had described. The historian wrote a paper about it, about the tension between doctrine and practical innovation, about how rigid training standards can prevent soldiers from adapting to actual combat conditions. The paper got some attention in military education circles, was cited in a few articles about marksmanship training, was used as an example of why doctrine needs to balance standardization with flexibility. But Reinhardt's technique was never incorporated into official training. It was too situational, too dependent on individual skill developed over years, too risky for soldiers who hadn't grown up shooting crows from barn rafters. Doctrine remained doctrine, emphasizing proper positions and stable platforms and methods that could be taught to thousands of soldiers with consistent results. Reinhardt died in 2002, 79 years old, in unified Germany that bore almost no resemblance to the country where he'd learned to shoot. His obituary mentioned his military service, noted that he'd been a sniper on the Eastern Front, didn't go into details. His children knew he'd been in the war, but knew almost nothing about what he'd done, what he'd survived, how he'd fought. The story of the Rafters' only sniper rest lived on mainly in academic papers and in discussions among marksmanship instructors who argued about the balance between speed and accuracy. It became one of those historical footnotes, interesting but not particularly important, a minor tactical innovation that had worked in specific circumstances but hadn't changed doctrine or training. But the deeper lesson of Reinhardt's story isn't about shooting techniques or tactical innovations. It's about the tension between expertise and experience, between doctrine written by experts and knowledge gained from practical application. The experts who wrote marksmanship doctrine weren't wrong. Their methods worked, were based on sound principles, were teachable and reproducible. But they were writing for normal circumstances, for training ranges and control conditions, for situations where soldiers had time to set up properly. Combat, especially desperate rearguard combat in a losing war, isn't normal circumstances. It's chaos and speed and constant adaptation, where the soldier who can deliver good results quickly often beats the soldier who can deliver perfect results slowly. Reinhardt understood this because his father had taught him to shoot crows, and crows are chaos and speed and constant adaptation. The skills transferred, even though the contexts were completely different. The military banned Reinhardt's technique because it couldn't be standardized, couldn't be taught reliably, depended on individual background and skill development that was impossible to replicate in training programs. That was a reasonable decision, a rational organizational choice. But it was also a decision that prevented other soldiers from learning methods that might have been effective, that might have saved lives, that might have changed outcomes in small ways that accumulate across thousands of engagements. There's no clear answer here, no simple lesson about whether Reinhardt was right or the doctrine writers were right. They were both right in their context, both solving different problems, both prioritizing different goals. Reinhardt wanted to survive and protect his squad, wanted to be as effective as possible in immediate combat situations. The doctrine writers wanted to create training programs that would produce competent snipers at scale, wanted methods that would work for average soldiers in average conditions. Those goals aren't incompatible, but they create tension, create situations where individual innovation conflicts with organizational standardization. Reinhardt's story is one example of that tension, but it played out thousands of times across the war. Every time a soldier found a better way to do something and was told to stop because their method wasn't teachable or wasn't safe or wasn't consistent with doctrine. Some of those innovations were genuinely bad ideas that worked once through luck and would get soldiers killed if attempted repeatedly. But some were genuine improvements, better methods that doctrine hadn't discovered yet, tactics that worked but couldn't be easily standardized. The challenge for military organizations is sorting out which is which innovations to embrace and which to suppress. Reinhardt's rafter technique probably fell somewhere in the middle. It worked for him, was genuinely effective in his hands, produced results that doctrine said were impossible, but it was also risky, dependent on skills most soldiers didn't have, probably would have gotten less experienced snipers killed if they'd attempted it. The military was probably right to ban it as standard practice, but they were also suppressing a technique that worked in the hands of someone who'd spent years developing the necessary skills. The real lesson is about expertise and where it comes from. The Wehrmacht sniper school taught marksmanship based on principles developed by experts over decades. That was valuable knowledge, systematized and teachable. But Reinhardt brought different expertise, learned from his father, who learned from his father, passed down through generations of farmers who needed to protect crops from crows. That was equally valuable knowledge, but it wasn't systematized, wasn't written down, existed only in practical application. When those two types of expertise conflicted, the military chose to systematize knowledge because that's what organizations do. They prioritize reproducibility over individual excellence, standardization over innovation, because those are the characteristics that let organizations function at scale. That's not a bad choice, but it does mean that knowledge like Reinhardt's father's knowledge gets lost, gets suppressed, gets dismissed as improvisation or cowboy nonsense instead of being recognized as legitimate expertise developed through different methods. Reinhardt's story is a reminder that expertise exists outside formal systems, that people learn valuable skills through experience that has nothing to do with official training, that sometimes a farmer who shoots crows knows things a military academy doesn't teach. Recognizing that kind of expertise, finding ways to incorporate it without disrupting standardization, is one of the harder problems military organizations face. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. The Rafters only sniper rest was banned because it couldn't be taught, because it was too individual, because it violated principles that experts had spent decades developing. But for 15 seconds on October morning in 1944, when two Soviet runners fell at 400 meters from a position that shouldn't have worked, Jakob Reinhardt proved that sometimes the experts are wrong, sometimes the farm boy knows better, and sometimes the best technique is the one your father taught you while hunting crows in a Saxon barn.